A king's passing ought to be marked with reverence, etched in grand prose, adorned with portraits, songs, a stately funeral, and a lasting legacy. Yet that's not how it went for this one. King Charles IX, ruler of mighty France, met such a ghastly, unhinged end that history itself seemed to flinch. His final hours weren't carefully noted in royal ledgers. They were wiped clean, not to honor his name but because they were too horrifying to fit the image of a monarch. To grasp why, you've got to look not at his death but at the carnage he set loose while he still drew breath. It was the summer of '69 and Charles, barely 20, was a young man burdened with a crown, caught in the web of France's cutthroat court, where his own mother, Catherine de' Medici, was the most cunning of all. France teetered on a knife's edge back then, its people divided between the dominant Catholics and the outspoken Protestants, called Huguenots. Then came St. Bartholomew's Day, August 18, 1569, a date forever stained with slaughter. In the looming shadow of the Louvre, while Paris hummed with the hollow joy of a royal wedding meant to bridge Catholics and Protestants, deadly commands were issued. With Charles's seal, Huguenot leaders were marked for death, their followers to be butchered without pity. The bloodshed roared through Paris like a wildfire, spilling into the countryside, leaving bodies piled like logs along the Seine, its waters running red. Infants were ripped from their mothers. Priests gave blessings to soldiers before they carried out what we'd now call genocide. Screams and the clash of steel rang through the city's narrow alleys. Some say over 8,000 Protestants were cut down in less than a week. When word of the massacre reached Charles IX, they say he let out a laugh, not one of triumph but of sheer panic. He'd lost all control. Then the coughing started. It'd be simple to cast Charles as a heartless tyrant, a fanatical Catholic king wiping out heretics. But the truth is messier. He was a puppet, pulled by rival factions, choked by paranoia, and trapped by a mother whose political genius was as cold as ice. Charles didn't order the killings from deep belief. He did it because he was scared. In the days after, Charles's mind started to come apart. He couldn't sleep, not from ghostly hauntings, but from the eerie quiet, the sudden hush of a city turned into a tomb. He kept pestering his ministers, his servants, anyone, asking, "How many died? Are they all gone? Did any slip away?" He wasn't eager to finish the job. He was terrified of revenge, convinced a lone Huguenot might creep into his room at night. His chambers became a fortress. His food was tested for poison. His letters burned before he'd read them. He never spoke without a dagger close at hand. This wasn't a king ruling. This was a king falling to pieces. Then the blood came, not from the slain, but from his own throat. At first, it was just fits of coughing, fevers with no cause. But soon those coughs turned brutal, leaving blood-streaked cloths and crimson stains on his royal sheets. The doctors were stumped. They called it consumption, a fancy term for what was clear. The king was wasting away from within. Whether it was tuberculosis or something darker, we can't say for sure. But one thing's certain. His death started long before his pulse faded. It began the moment he signed the order that doomed thousands, the moment he became a killer of his own people. Charles IX's reign didn't just end with his death. It crumbled bit by bit as his mind shattered. His lungs bled, and history's weight smothered him like a heavy cloak. He was still breathing, but his legacy was already gone. Long before blood filled his lungs, Charles IX's mind was already sinking. Historians often skim over the years between the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre and his death, as if it's just sickness and a slow fade. But those years held something far darker than disease. It was madness. Quiet, creeping, personal madness. The kind that doesn't crash in like a storm but slips in like a whisper, eating a man alive in the silent hours when no one's looking. After the massacre, Charles stopped sleeping altogether. Records from the royal household say he'd pace his rooms for days, moving like a man in a daze. When he did collapse into sleep, it brought no peace. His screams echoed through the palace halls. One night, a servant rushed in, thinking an assassin had slipped inside, only to find Charles thrashing in his bed, eyes wide, arms swinging, choking on his own spit, pleading with invisible figures to stop the blades. Those blades were real, just not there. They lived in his memories, in Paris's blood-soaked streets, in the necks of the dead. Charles started seeing things. He'd spot ghosts at court feasts or hear crying from the hearth. Servants swore he'd whisper apologies to empty air or shout orders at unseen foes. Once, it said, he tried to curse his own reflection, yelling at a silver mirror until he smashed it with his dagger's hilt. The doctors called it melancholia, their term for deep mental turmoil, but that word barely touched what was happening. Today, we might call it PTSD with heavy psychotic symptoms. But Charles's torment wasn't just his own. It shook the whole kingdom. France didn't just see a king fading. It watched him rot before their eyes. He stopped listening to his advisors. He trusted no one. Not even his mother, Catherine, who once controlled his every move. To Charles, everyone was scheming. The walls seemed to listen, the hallways seemed to watch, and the servants were spies. Food was poison. Bedsheets might hide toxins. He stopped washing, spoke in broken phrases, let his hair grow wild, his nails dark with ink and blood. He'd claw at his arms until they bled, muttering he couldn't wash it off. Whether it was sweat or the stain of the massacre, no one knew. What rattled the court most wasn't his paranoia. It was his obsession with death, not his own but others. He demanded to read vivid accounts of executions, asking about the way bodies jerked, how long heads stayed aware after the axe fell, what a man's eyes looked like as life left them. He'd pore over anatomical sketches for hours, his shaky fingers tracing the veins in the throat. He scribbled verses about the dead, one found crumpled, smeared with wine and blood, reading, "Let their bodies drift along the river, mouths agape, limbs lifeless, but me. I still hear their cries echoing in my ears." This wasn't a king governing anymore. He was a man tormented by his own history, his throne slowly morphing into a tomb. The tight-knit group around Charles started to splinter. Catherine de' Medici, who once controlled every detail of her son's reign, began keeping her distance, retreating to another wing of the palace. She'd witnessed kings die before, but nothing like this. Not so raw, so festering, so painfully laid bare. Court gossip claimed she moved rooms to escape the smell. Not just a figure of speech, but a real, choking stench. Charles's health was crumbling fast, his body turning traitor. His coughs came in such brutal spasms that servants thought he was vomiting. His bed linens, soaked with blood, needed changing 3 times a night, and the maids covered their faces with cloths to bear it. On the worst nights, Charles sat alone at his desk, scribbling not royal decrees but confessions. Pages of them, some readable, others ruined by ink and spit, none ever kept in official records. One servant girl swore she saw a sheet covered with the words, "I didn't want them to die," repeated hundreds of times. This wasn't the grand, poetic madness of a Shakespearean monarch, like King Lear raging against a storm with eloquent fury on a windswept heath. No, this was something far rawer and more harrowing. Instead, it was the shattering of a man's mind, crumbling under the unbearable burden of his own actions, unable to escape the crushing guilt that haunted every moment of his tortured existence. Yet, the court refused to let him slip away. Not yet, not while the kingdom still needed a figurehead, no matter how broken he was. France demanded a king, even one whose mind was unraveling, whose clothes were stained with his own blood, who saw the faces of dead children staring back from every polished mirror in the palace. So they locked the heavy doors, stifled his anguished cries, pulled the thick curtains tight to block out the world, and pretended their monarch was still whole, a king in name if not in truth. By early 1571, Charles IX no longer resembled a king, nor even a man capable of standing tall in the royal court he once commanded. The vibrant young man who had once marched proudly through Fontainebleau's lush gardens, clad in gleaming armor with musicians and nobles trailing in his wake, now shuffled feebly through shadowy corridors, racked by bloody coughs, barely able to hold himself upright. He'd become a hushed rumor among the courtiers, a spectral figure haunting the very palace he was meant to rule, more ghost than sovereign. The king no longer governed. He merely bled life away, slowly and violently, His decline laid bare before a court too terrified to acknowledge the horrifying truth unfolding in their midst. What started as stress, fear, and visions had grown into something brutally physical. His lungs, torn apart by months of relentless coughing, began to bleed heavily. His once fair skin turned a sickly gray, marred with bruises that bloomed without cause along his back and ribs. His hands trembled without pause, fingers quivering like leaves in a storm, while his teeth, once strong, grew loose and fell out one by one, leaving his mouth a hollow ruin. The royal physicians, desperate for explanations, called it consumption to sound learned, but Charles wasn't merely fading. He was decaying alive, his body betraying him with every ragged breath. By spring, an overpowering stench of decay hung over Charles, so vile that even the finest, most expensive perfumes from the royal stores couldn't mask the grim, nauseating odor radiating from the king's deteriorating body, now a shadow of its former majesty. His bed linens, soaked through with sweat and caked with thick, dark blood, were collected each day and burned to ashes in a desperate attempt to erase the physical proof of his body's unstoppable descent into ruin, leaving no trace of the gruesome evidence. The heavy carpets were hauled out of the royal chambers, and every window was thrown open wide, allowing the breezes of Paris to sweep through the palace, carrying away the suffocating, sickly reek of a monarch wasting away into the grip of death. Servants, overwhelmed by the relentless horror, began fainting under the strain. Many begged to be reassigned elsewhere, unable to bear the grueling, heart-wrenching task of tending to a king whose body was falling apart before their very eyes. Those who stayed on were given double their usual wages, a grim and meager reward for enduring the nightmarish ordeal of caring for a ruler whose physical decay unfolded in grotesque, unrelenting detail day after day. Charles's decline was far from quiet. It was accompanied by a bone-chilling symphony of suffering, a haunting cacophony of anguished sounds that echoed through the palace, leaving everyone who heard it shaken and forever marked by the terror. His breaths, wet and rattling like water trapped in stone, echoed down the cold corridors, punctuated by hacking coughs that tore through the air like tortured cries. At night, the palace reverberated with the anguished sounds of a man battling to hold his crumbling body together, each gasp a testament to his losing fight against death. Every cough, every shudder, every twitch felt to Charles like a penalty for his sins. The massacre clung to him, never leaving, not for a moment. Sometimes he'd scream the names of Huguenot victims in the dead of night, names only he could hear. Other times, he'd plead with invisible foes to end it fast. He knew death was coming. The only question was how long it would drag out and how much of him would remain. Jean d'Aubagne, a royal physician, wrote that Charles's hallucinations grew so vivid, he once leaped from his bed, certain a mob of Protestants was climbing through his window. It was just the wind stirring a tapestry, but to him it was vengeance come to life. Servants padded the walls with cushions after he smashed a golden goblet against the stone in a fit of rage and confusion. He cut his own hand open, sobbing, "It's not enough! It's not enough!" One unnamed courtier claimed Charles turned to them in the dark and whispered, "The blood's inside me now, it never stops." But it wasn't just his mind failing. By March, Charles was heaving up blood. Not mere flecks but torrents, gushing after nearly every meal, staining the fine linens and leaving servants scrambling to clean the mess before it soaked through to the floorboards. His body withered so rapidly that his once grand royal robes, tailored for a king's stature, hung loose and had to be pinned tightly to his skeletal frame, flapping like sails on a broken mast. His cheekbones jutted out sharply, like blades pressing against skin so thin it seemed translucent, stretched taut over a face that no longer resembled the young monarch who'd once commanded courts. His voice, once clear and commanding, dwindled to a rough, gravelly whisper. His piercing ice-blue eyes, once keen with royal intent, turned bloodshot and hazy, as if gazing at phantoms in a realm beyond mortal sight. For his final weeks, he lay confined to a single bed in a dim, curtained chamber, where the air was thick with the stench of rot and the sharp tang of vinegar-soaked bandages used to stem his endless bleeding. Sunlight, once a symbol of royal radiance, now seemed to sear his fragile body. He pleaded for the heavy drapes to stay drawn, shielding him from its unbearable glare. The world outside, its vibrancy, its life, had become an overwhelming burden, too heavy for a king whose spirit and body were crumbling under the weight of his own deeds. Blood began to seep from his gums, his nose, even his ears, trickling in thin, relentless streams that marked his face like a grim map of his suffering. His body was like a dam breached by a flood, with blood leaking from every weakened seam, pooling beneath him and staining everything it touched in a relentless tide of decay. The royal physicians, powerless to halt the hemorrhaging, resorted to frantic measures, cupping his bruised skin, forcing purges, even draining more blood in a futile attempt to restore some imagined balance, only hastening his descent into ruin. None of it helped. It only sped up his collapse. Each time they touched him, he seemed to come back less human, as if his body was shrinking from the guilt it carried. The courtiers stopped speaking loudly. Their voices dropped to whispers, orders given in hushed tones, servants moving on tiptoe. Even the nurses held back tears when they left his side. Not from lack of sorrow, but from fear of disturbing the little peace he could still find. Charles wasn't unconscious. He was awake, aware, right to the end. His mind flickered like a candle in a storm. But when he spoke, it was often just one word: blood. Yet no priest stood by him, no forgiveness was offered, because Charles wasn't facing death. He was enduring a judgment. The Louvre's walls soaked it all in. The stench, the sounds, the slow collapse of a king whose body had become a war zone of guilt and decay. This wasn't just sickness. It was a reckoning. Some deaths carve out a legacy, but others are so horrific, so deeply unnatural, that even history turns away from them. Charles IX's final hours were the latter kind. No royal scribe dared pen the full truth, not because they didn't see it, but because what they witnessed was too horrific to commit to parchment. France craved a legacy, not a nightmare. A monarch, not a rotting shell choking on his own blood. It was May 25, 1571. Outside, dawn's light crept over Paris, but inside, in a shadowy, velvet-curtained death chamber, the young king was writhing in the final throes of an end too ghastly to name. The few allowed to stand watch described a scene more like a battlefield medic's tent than a royal deathbed. The bed wasn't just stained. It was drenched, heavy with blood, mucus, and sweat, needing fresh linens every few hours. Yet Charles often refused to let them change the sheets, whispering, "Leave it be, let it tell the truth." He no longer looked like France's king. His face was gaunt, lips split and discolored, his body jerking endlessly as if something inside fought to break free. Blood, both crusted and fresh, coated his mouth like a grim lacquer. His eyes didn't settle on people anymore. They flicked to dark corners, the doorway, the ceiling, as if waiting for judgment to fall from above. In those final hours, his voice was no longer human. Gasps strangled by fluid, guttural groans. Sudden wails that cut through the thick air and left servants fleeing in tears. One unnamed courtier wrote that Charles spoke without sound and wept without tears. Yet he remained fully aware. A lone physician, in a private journal, claimed that on his last night, blood trickled from Charles's eyes, like tears from shattered veins. No official record backs this, but this respected doctor swore he saw thin streams of blood slide down the king's face, a grotesque mimicry of sorrow, acted out not by his soul but by his failing body. At one point that night, Charles tried to rise from his bed. His legs gave out, too frail, too wasted to hold him. He crumpled to the floor, pleading, "Don't lift me. Let me stay with them." Whether he meant the slain Huguenots, his royal ancestors, or the phantoms in his room's shadows, no one dared ask. At the room's edge, his mother stood, silent as stone. Catherine de' Medici, once France's most commanding figure, watched her son's death with a face carved from ice. No tears, no cries, no murmured prayers. She'd orchestrated deaths before, but this was a monstrosity, a collapse not just of a man but of the crown itself. This wasn't a deathbed. It was a grim lesson. At sunrise, Charles began vomiting blood so fiercely that even the guards turned away, unable to stomach the sight. His body convulsed, chest lurching with each heave, the sound of blood splattering on stone floors mingling with his screams. Nurses scrambled to clean it, slipping on the slick ground. No one spoke a word. By 8 a.m., one doctor noted what he called a total bodily collapse. His skin went gray, his fingers twisted into claw-like shapes, as if grasping at something invisible. His eyes rolled back, his jaw locked tight, and then silence. But he didn't die yet. For 2 more hours, Charles lingered in a tortured limbo, his breath a faint rasp, his pulse wild, his lips moving as if trying to speak. Those who leaned and heard broken pieces of a prayer. "Forgive the blood. My people, pardon." At 10:07 m.m., the bleeding stopped, not by healing, but because his heart gave out, because his guilt had no more blood to spill. There was no grand declaration, no ringing bells, no proclamation from the palace balcony. Just Catherine's quiet order, "Lock the room." What followed was a cover-up. No death mask was crafted, no public viewing held, no grand march through Paris's streets. His burial was hurried, his name barely mentioned at court in the weeks after. A king had died, but more than that, a horror show had unfolded, one too unsettling for the royal records. Chroniclers chose ambiguity, writing of decline, of wasting illness, of consumption. They sidestepped the truth. The blood-drenched sheets, the screams, the stench, the final murmurs. Because Charles IX's end wasn't just a king's death. It was the shattering of dignity, of the myth that kings die nobly. He'd ruled in blood, and in blood he sank. France, unwilling to face that reality, did what courts do with ugly truths. They buried them, not just the body but the memory. They didn't forget his death. They erased it. A king's death usually calls for reverence, not just for the man but for the legend. Funerals become spectacles, bodies become relics, historians turn into poets. But when Charles IX died, the world didn't grieve. It didn't bow. It looked away, because some deaths aren't mourned, they're managed. In the days after, Catherine de' Medici moved fast. There was no space for sorrow, no time for reflection. The nightmare that played out behind those locked doors couldn't be allowed to taint the crown. The madness, the bodily decay, the image of a king begging for forgiveness as blood leaked from his eyes. It all had to vanish. She ordered his room sealed tight. The blood-soaked linens were burned, the mattress thrown out, the stained stone floor scrubbed with vinegar and lime until it cracked. His body, already swollen and rigid, was wrapped without fanfare. No embalming, no portrait, no wax cast. There'd be no royal death mask, a tradition nearly every European monarch followed, because this wasn't about mourning. It was about containment. Catherine called in her propagandists, poets, scribes, artists, not to honor Charles but to erase him in spirit as the priests prepared to bury him in flesh. The official story of his death was short, clean, and lifeless. His Majesty passed quietly after a prolonged, noble illness. No word of the blood, the cries, or the king clawing at the floor, muttering names never logged in court records. The funeral was postponed, then stripped down. What should have been a grand parade through Paris became a private affair, heavily guarded, open only to a select few nobles and clergy. The people of France, especially those still haunted by the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, weren't invited to grieve. They were told to forget, and they did because Catherine made sure of it.